Hello.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
The the slide deck. All right. All right. Good morning. This will be our third chapter for accounting information system. This is quite a lengthy topic, so I was expecting that this will cover probably up to next week of our schedule. Last week, I wasn't able to hold any class webinars since I was inundated with several deadlines. So we'll just have our lecture this week today. So our topic will be computer fraud and abuse techniques. So what are those abuses that may be perpetuated by scrupulous individuals using computer and information technology? And what are these types of techniques that we may encounter in the near future as we, navigate the corporate world or when we start our own business ventures, obviously using the available technology, right? So let's start our discussion with fraud, right? Because fraud is basically the basis of many of these abuses or techniques. So fraud is defined as any act or activity intended to gain an unfair advantage over another person. So if you say fraud, the intention of that particular act must be to take or to get an unfair advantage, but not necessarily anything that would, get an unfair advantage would be considered as fraud. There are certain elements, elements that must be present in order for a particular act be considered as fraudulent. We have five elements. First would be it must be comprised of a false statement, a representation, or disclosure. And it must be a material fact, which induces a person to act. There must be an intent to deceive by the person making the statement or representation. And upon making such representation, another person has justifiably relied on such representation. Meaning, a person relied on that act to take a necessary action. And of course, the resulting situation would be an injury or loss to that person relying on such misrepresentation. And if you notice, these five elements have to be present in order for a particular act be considered as fraudulent. Sinabi kasi must be. And if you later go to law school, you realize that these particular elements are actually, in one way or another, comprise as well the crime of estafa or swindling. So basically, these elements, absent of one, would actually, make that particular act not fraudulent. Meaning, if someone would actually make a representation, that's actually fraud. But at the end of the day, if no one has actually relied upon it, hindi siya pinansin, or wala naman siyang effect, that injury or loss, then basically it's just like that, a person lying or something, that an act that does not result into an injury. All right. So again, you have to look into these elements in order to consider a particular act as fraudulent. And according to the study of Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, which covered not only the United States but other countries as well, and in a global scale, a typical organization loses 5% of its annual revenue to fraud. And a global fraud losses, a total of which would be 3.7 trillion US dollars. So quite big, huh? For an annual loss related to fraud. So 3.7 trillion US dollars. Imagine how many schools will be built by that particular loss, or how many children will be fed by that particular loss in Africa or Yemen. So quite hefty, quite a very massive loss, and it could all be attributed to fraud. And according to the same study by the ACFE, the fraud committed by executives or those occupying high positions in many corporations or companies around the world actually account for the biggest chunk of these fraud losses. In fact, these executives, if they committed fraud, the total loss that would result would be actually 4 times higher than those of made or perpetrated by managers or mid-level managers, and 11 times bigger than that committed by rank and file or regular employees. All right. So again, if you can actually surmise from these study that the level or the total costs of losses that can be attributed to fraud is directly proportionate to the position of a particular individual. And that's only expected, considering that the higher you climb the corporate ladder, the bigger your responsibility, and of course, the bigger the amounts that you will be shouldering or you'll be allowed to transact, and at the same time, the less, of course, that you are subject to authorizations and review, because you're already the reviewing officer. You are already on the top of everyone. So basically, committing a fraud would be a lot easier compared to mid-level managers and those rank and file employees. And in fact, it was actually showed in the what happened with Enron, that executives colluding with one another to perpetrate fraud can actually result to a reverberating effect of losses on a national scale. Enron, when it collapsed due to financial statement reporting fraud, which it had, which it was able to do with collusion with its auditing partner Arthur Andersen, has the collapse of which has nearly resulted to the collapse as well of the U.S. national economy. And in order to address that particular problem, where executives, members of the top level positions, decision makers like CEO, CFO, and members of the board of directors, the US Congress now devised a new legislation that would curb this, what it seems to be unlimited power of top level executives, and ensure that there will be more compliance with respect to financial reporting, to management, and at the same time, the composition of top level executives. So they crafted now and passed a law known as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. And many of these provisions of this particular law have been complied not only by US companies, but companies around the world, including the Philippines. Why? Because in order for you to participate in the US market or to do business in the US, you have to show the US Regulatory Board, the US Securities and Exchange Commission, that there has been compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. So if you noticed, Philippine companies would have independent directors, at least two independent directors, because these are required under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. They're not even required by Philippine legislation or existing Philippine laws. But since they're trying to do business in the US, they have to comply. Or an independent audit committee, which is also required by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. So, yun yung naging effect, because Enron, when it collapsed, parang nag-loosen ang trust ng market with the US stock exchange or the US stock market. And in fact, it resulted as well to the collapse of Arthur Andersen, which was then the #1 auditing firm in the world. So imagine, you are an auditing firm, you're top of your game in the business, and then you were implicated in a scandal. And then it has resulted not only the collapse of the client or the company, but your own demise as well. Because again, it has diminished the trust of the clients and they pulled out from Arthur Andersen. So now we're left with the big four. So we have Deloitte, which is the biggest in revenue. We have PricewaterhouseCoopers, of course, the most prestigious one, and an alumna of PwC. And then we also have Ernst & Young, EY, which is #3 or ranked third in terms of, say, revenue. But it's more popular in the Philippines, considering that its partner in the Philippines is SGV and Company, which is the biggest in the Philippines. So therefore, people might create a notion or an impression that EY is globally dominant, but no, it's not really. It's a distant third. Kasi close lang kasi ang Deloitte and PwC. So, and then we have KPMG. So again, that's the resulting effect of executive fraud. Nag-change, nag-alter din ang market amongst auditing firms because, again, Arthur Andersen collapsed. Now, in our discussion with fraud, you would also encounter several terms that we have to discuss as well in order for us to comprehensively cover this particular chapter. And one common term that you will encounter is corruption. And corruption is quite common, especially in the Philippines, in the developing world, where many members of the government officers and officials would continuously be implicated with corruption allegations or corruption scandals. So you always hear about this term in the news. So what is corruption? Corruption is in dishonest conduct by those holding power, those in power, and it all often involves actions that are illegitimate, immoral, or incompatible with ethical standards. So what are the most common examples? It may include bribery. Bribery is committed when you try to give money or any pecuniary value or amount to a government official or officer in order for you to receive a certain benefit. It could be, say, the grant of a contract or a favorable ordinance or resolution by a particular local government unit in order to favor your business. Those kinds of acts are, still called corruption, whether small or big, because that's bribery. You're trying to bribe a member of the civil service or the government in order to reap certain benefits. Or rigging the bid. Say the government has a procurement department and they're trying to bid contracts to private individuals or private entities. And these projects could run in hundreds of millions or even billions, especially infra projects. And in order for you to bid, you have to submit a blind bid, meaning you have to submit to the government your proposal, the total cost including the scope and the quality of service. And you don't know what would be the bid of other entities or other companies. And usually the government would choose the lowest bid for the highest quality or the largest benefit to the government. So ganun dapat ang sistema. But usually what will happen is someone from another construction company would collude with the procurement department or the bidding committee to ensure that they will win the bid. And to ensure that one is they will pay the members of the bidding committee certain kickbacks or amounts to ensure the victory. And then the moment that they get the contract, obviously, it's a multi-billion one. You don't get that much really in the private sector. So, tiba-tiba na rin yung construction company na yan. So, maliit na amount na lang yung ibibigay to the bidding committee. So, that's also a form of corruption. But take note, class, that corruption is not only limited to anything illegal. It could also be immoral, something that is totally against the moral mores or social mores of a particular community or a country. Kasi social mores naman is not specific, it's not naman uniform globally. It could be something that is socially acceptable to another society, may not necessarily be acceptable with another. But again, there are also moral standards that quite universal, like say killing someone or raping someone. These are universal moral standards. So anything that is immoral can also be considered corruption. But the third one is quite gray, considering that these may not be illegal, but they're quite unethical. As an example of this one would probably be what happened during the hearings of franchise renewal of ABS-CBN, where it was found out that ABS-CBN is cleverly employing our incentives law, our tax incentives law, the PEZA law, as well as the concurrent corporate regulations in order to avoid the payment of its actual taxes. So imagine if you've been the number one TV network in the country and you're the largest entertainment conglomerate in the country by far. I mean, double the size of revenue of the number two network. And then you've paid probably around 1.4 billion pesos for 4 years, whereas the number two network has paid around 1.8 billion pesos for the single year, 2018 alone. In fact, in the recent disclosure of GMA Network, it has disclosed that it has paid 2.2 billion pesos for 2019 alone, taxes. And it does not include even the withholding taxes and compensation of its employees. Simply just the tax of GMA is 2.2 billion pesos. And ABS-CBN is paying around how much? Around 100 million per year. And I'm not saying it's illegal because those are legal mechanisms. We have the PEZA law. So ABS-CBN registered an entity in PEZA, Big Dipper. And being a PEZA entity, you enjoy 5% preferential tax rate. So ABS-CBN tried to send its products or services or content to Big Dipper, and these sales are actually VAT exempt because you are a PEZA registered. You're deemed to be exempt also of your purchases. So that's also another clever avoidance of payment of taxes. And there's nothing wrong about it. But what leaves bad taste with it is considering that you are already granted a privilege for 25 years to use now the state-owned frequency, which is Channel 2 or Channel 4 in Davao. They don't have to pay anything. They use the frequency, they air their shows sa TV ninyo, and they air advertisements of it. And because it's free TV, meaning people don't have to do anything to get the signal or the frequency, what happened was you have mass access to people who can't afford cable or streaming. And therefore, these people are consumers. So if you're an advertiser, you want to reach as many people as you want for a 30-minute or a 15-minute, or no, 30-second or 15-second advertisement. Okay? So the more audience you get, the higher the rate, obviously. And ABS-CBN is making billions out of it. And then you try to avoid payment taxes. So it sounds unethical. And that was the basis of the argument, but that was not highlighted in Congress during the hearings. But that was the point. We agree that it's not illegal, but is it unethical? Because your competitors are paying the right taxes because they know that you're using the frequency for free, right? It's like eating or biting the hands that feed you. You are already granted this benefit, but you're also trying to give the person feeding you an unfair advantage. And isn't it that if you are a public service entity, if it's truly in the service of the Filipino people, you have to give back properly to the state what the state it should be owed, because again, the state is allowing you to use the facility. So that was another thing. Is it illegal? No, it's legal. It's actually within the bounds of law. But is it ethical? That's another question, which also can qualify as corruption, right? Now, another form of fraud is investment fraud, which is the misrepresentation of facts in order to promote an investment that promises fantastic profits with little or no risk. So the many types of investment fraud, and the most popular one would be the Ponzi scheme, where the perpetrators would actually convince people to part ways of their money as a sort of investment and promising them returns. But the truth is, wala talagang viable business or anything that would actually ensure that income will continuously be earned to support these promises of returns. So what will happen now is they try to recruit and invest more from more people, because the initial investors will now have to receive the promised returns. So what will happen now is the initial amount accumulated will be paid off to those initially who invested, and they would get more now from more people, and then they would pay off the next. So the money is not really growing per se, but rather they're just pulling in cash from different people and then paying off the people who have invested initially. And obviously it would run out. And if it runs out and no more people are investing, it would definitely collapse. So that's Ponzi scheme. And we've already encountered it one several months ago with Kappa and the rest of these investment scams in Mindanao. And if you learn it enough, and you've been a business student, you've studied accounting, you'll definitely know that when you check the financial statements of these entities, that it would be impossible for them to support these kinds of promises, yung promise nila ng returns. Because if you compare it with, say, BPI or BDO, these banks offer tiny amounts of interest, like super maliit, like for your bank deposits. But these companies are the country's biggest banks in terms of asset base, including Metro Bank. And they invested so much in businesses that are healthy, performing well. But why is it that they're only offering small returns? Because again, those are the return level, the rate that they're offering are the healthy rates that would ensure the survival and the going concern um, status of the business. Because any higher than that, considering that they're also catering to millions of Filipinos, it would already be non-feasible. And that's after a careful study. But these companies sprung from nowhere are offering how much? Again, 20% monthly? Jesus Christ. But of course, people fell on the kind of promises, considering that, it's a quick profit, quick rich schemes. And a lot of Filipinos do actually fall for it, not because, we're lazy enough, but because it's something that, really enticing. And especially in an age where we actually are really making money and we're really spending much. We're the lucky generation that we do have extra money to support our travels, our hobbies, and anything else. I mean, the previous generation didn't have that kind of opportunity, so they also tried to double their money. And you know it's quite disheartening that many have lost their money because of these frauds, right? And there are two types of fraud that are important to businesses. First one is misappropriation of assets, yung actual assets that can be found within the company. One important or the most important example of this one would be companies that are involved with fast exchange of cash, like yung mga groceries, or businesses that have fast consumer goods. So because the money or the currency is fast exchanging from one hand to another, it would be difficult to track now the balances, and therefore you have to ensure to provide intensive or stringent internal controls to ensure or to minimize now the level of thefts or stealing by your employees. Because I mean, it's easy for them to get certain amount that could not be detected, and then appropriate this for their own benefit. That's why if you notice sa mga cashiers sa malls, they carry parang their own boxes when the shift starts, and then the one that will leave the cashier will carry her own box, yung parang drawer lalagay sa POS or point of sale system, because that particular box will contain now a starting amount that was recorded in the name of the cashier, and the cashier now will have a total amount at the end of her shift, that amount, starting amount, plus the total sales that she will make, which will match now the total records in the POS from the start of her shift up to the end. So ima-match yun siya. Kaya lagi mo naririnig, di ba, sa malls na short or over. Pag na-over yan, meaning it's credited to the company or to the grocery. Say, instead na ang sale niya is ang sale niya is 60,000, yeah, tapos meron siyang starting balance na say 10,000, because di ba kailangan din mag-change or mag-provide ng sukle, right? So ang total niya would be say 70,000. Pero ang total ng binilang is 70,500. The cash over will be credited to the grocery. Pero pag hindi yan siya naging over, like naging under yan siya, charge yan siya against the cashier. So ibabawas yan sa sweldo niya. Like say, if supposed to be the records per POS is 60,000, then 10,000 nga yung starting. Pero yung na-record lang is 69,500. So instead of 70. So yung 500 na yan, that will be reduced from the cashier's sahod. Magkano ba yung daily nila? That's roughly around the daily wage of the cashier. So it's quite disheartening then. Because again, the overage will not go to them. It will go to the grocery company like SM or Robinsons, and then pag under sa kanila ibabawas, di ba? So it's quite disheartening, those kinds of policies. And of course, the bigger kind of fraud is financial fraudulent financial reporting, which is sometimes called management fraud, because again, it's also only management that actually prepares the financial statements of the entity. So these two types of frauds we'll discuss later in great detail. So let's proceed with the next Next one, which is misappropriation of assets. It is the theft of company assets by employees. Ito yung personal properties which are movable that are easily be stolen and appropriated for personal gain. An example would be a manager, say Albert Milano, responsible for processing bills, the ABS-CBN. And then he was able to embezzle 20 million over a 5-year period by forging now his superior's signature on invoices for services that were never performed. It means that the invoices are to be payable to a bogus supplier or vendor. And then, since he was able to forge the signature, he was able to process it and submit to the accounts payable department. And then accounts payable, sent the green signal or the go signal, considering that all signatures naman are present. And then he was able to forge the endorsement of the check and then deposited it to his bank account. Kasi considering na bogus nga yung anong tawag dyan, yung payee, which is the supplier. I think the fatal problem here is because he deposited in his own account. The processing now may be foolproof, meaning kasi na-forge niya ang signature, but the fact is it's a bank statement and the bank now can actually see the recipients. And why are we sending money to a manager of a company? So that's another mistake that he did, but he was discovered only after 5 years. So he was able to use the funds to buy an expensive house, 5 cars, and a boat. Pero 20 million lang. So ang issue ko dito is, kung 5 cars na yan, tas expensive yung home, tas may boat pa for total of 20 million, the house must be maliit, no? That must be a tiny house. But that's another story. Now let's go to another example, which is a bank executive, a vice president, was able to approve a 1 billion peso loan in exchange for 585,000 in kickbacks. So he was given 585,000 to, look the other way and, approve that kind of loan. And the particular applicant of the loan may not qualify financially. Parang the financial statements may not be enough in order for it to qualify for that particular loan. The loan now cost the bank 800 million and helped trigger $800 million and helped trigger its collapse. So nag-collapse pa yung bank because of that particular misappropriation. If you notice, ang misappropriation niya is the 585,000 pesos, which resulted now to the granting of 1 billion peso loan. Na-expose pa tuloy yung banks. Yung bank na yan for a bad loan. And another example would be a Cebu newspaper manager who went to work to a competitor after he was fired. But since his access were not revoked, he was still able to browse in the computer files of the newspaper for exclusive stories that he would then try to get with his new employer, with his new newspaper. And therefore, it's tantamount to misappropriation of assets because the computer files, the server, and even the stories, the exclusive stories that the newspaper, his old newspaper, were able to accumulate were, intellectual properties. And he was able to browse them for his own benefit. So that's still a misappropriation of assets. All right? Now let's proceed to fraudulent financial reporting, which is an intentional or reckless conduct, whether by act or omission, that results in materially misleading financial statements. Take note, guys, that fraudulent financial reporting may not necessarily always be intentional. There could be reckless conduct as well, meaning inadvertence or negligence on the part of the accountant or the bookkeeper to actually report the balances correctly. And sometimes it may be negligence, but the resulting effect would be massive enough that would actually result to the collapse of the business. Because sometimes if balances were not present and were not correct, and they may paint a different picture, say a bad performance of the company, and a company is publicly listed, meaning it's being traded in the stock exchange, a financial performance that is not desirable for the investors may lead to a massive drop, or a decline in the stock price of the company. And that's what happened with ABS-CBN. I mean, circa 2010, parang start, mga first year ni Pinoy as president, or even 2011, ABS-CBN stocks are trading around 55 pesos. And now, upon the decline or the rejection of the franchise application, it's been trading for about 14 pesos na lang. Imagine if you've actually bought your shares at 55 and you're holding them for so long, banking on the fact that ABS-CBN will perform better, considering that they're really ahead in terms of digitalization and even in streaming local content. Kasi wala pa namang streaming device ang GMA. Ang TV5 meron na with Signal Play. But again, they're still way behind, considering that content is king. Meaning you can build your application, you can build your streaming technology, but at the end of the day, what actually people want to see in the streaming service would be the content. And ABS-CBN is king in content. It's unparalleled in terms of producing Filipino content. So you've invested, and then all of a sudden, they lost the frequency, roughly about 52% of its total revenue, around 20 billion pesos annually. So obviously, yung trust ng stock market has declined rapidly. And since last year, it's been trading na lang for about 18 pesos, 16 pesos, and parang nag-stabilize na lang siya ngayon at 14, considering na hindi naman talaga mamamatay ang ABS-CBN. It would still be a content production company, even without Channel 2. Problema na ngayon is may COVID, which they cannot ramp to their programming capacity, kasi ABS-CBN also owns parang studios or mga meron silang bago sa Bulacan, 'di ba, na sound stages na Hollywood type, na very massive facilities that they can actually recreate airports or airport lobbies, or hotels or restaurants inside a studio. Parang US production, like parang yung, 'di ba, pag nanonood ka ng Brooklyn Nine-Nine, parang lalabas sila ng precinct and parang magno-New York lang. But that particular scene is a set. Hindi sila nagsushoot talaga sa New York on location. Kasi hindi naman nagsushoot ang Brooklyn Nine-Nine sa New York talaga. Di ba? Parang it's an LA production. So, if you think of it, they can recreate or replicate cities through sets. Malaki talaga yung sound stages na yan. Na mga box na parang malalaking SM, pero sa loob is hollow lang. Di ba? Studios, parang ganun. So, ABS-CBN is already ready for that. But they lost something na important to support the entire operation. So, quite saddening. But obviously, it affected their stock price. But anyhow, let's go back to fraudulent financial reporting. The purpose of the falsification of the financial statements is really to deceive investors and creditors. And the purpose is to increase the company's stock price or to meet cash flow needs or hide losses. And ito yung naging problem ng Enron, kasi they've been incurring losses for quite some time na, mga parang 5 years. But they try to embellish their financial statements by hiding these losses. How they were able to do it? They set up shell companies in tax haven entities or tax haven countries, like, say, British Virgin Islands or Cayman Islands or the Barbados. And then, lahat ng losses nila, charge nila sa mga shell companies. So yung FS mismo ng Enron sa US is very maganda. It's very healthy. It's very, it's performing well. So obviously, it has constantly increased its stock price. And it was exacerbated pa by the fact that the executives of Enron are receiving stock options as part of their compensation package. Meaning they would also be indirectly benefited by the increase of stock price. Kasi yung sahod nila is stocks, partly cash. So imagine if they would continuously increase the stock price, obviously the stocks, the value of the stocks that they will receive at the end of the year would also be quite high. And they have the knowledge na hindi naman talaga totoo yung performance ng Enron. They would sell it eventually after receiving or after the stock options have vested. They would sell it eventually na parang benta agad. So cash ulit, gain on their part. So talaga tiba-tiba ang executives. And then nag-collapse. So I mean, wala naman talagang natatagong baho, diba, at the end of the day. I mean, aabot talaga sa point that it will collapse and eventually be discovered. And in order to reduce for the fraudulent financial reporting, there are 4 main actions that the management of the company would have to do. First is to establish an organizational environment that contributes to the integrity of the financial reporting process. One of the breakthrough of Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 is to institute now an independent audit committee amongst the board of directors that will be comprised by the independent directors. And if you notice in the Philippines, many entities would hire now reputable individuals or persons as independent directors. And they will usually be the directors or parts or members of the audit committee. Sino yung mga usual na mga independent directors na ina-appoint? Mga retired chief justices ng Supreme Court or retired associate justices, because they are supposed to be men of good reputation. And this good reputation would now add to the integrity of the audit committee. So it would send now to the business community that these companies are actually compliant because part of their board, members of the board of directors, are respected members of the judiciary. In fact, former chief justices. So ganun ang effect. So magandang business din yung pagiging chief justice post-term pag nag-retire ka kasi tiba-tiba ka rin kasi nga, di ba, massive companies ito. So if you're an independent director, parang may mga meetings yan, 6 meetings a year, tapos per dime ka lang, tapos usually mga per dime niyan, aabot yan ng hundreds of thousands, in fact, million pa. Tiba-tiba ka dyan, tapos final tax na yan. So pag receive mo, meron na yung withholding. So wala ka nang gagawin, receive ka na lang, di ba? Ang saya. But obviously, for you to reach a certain point, you must have done a lot in your life kasi hindi ka naman magiging Chief Justice ng Supreme Court by doing nothing, di ba? So you must have done great things naman in your younger days. Second is to identify and understand the factors that lead to fraudulent financial reporting. Ano ba yung mga problema? You identify and you address these problems head-on. Third, assess the risk of fraudulent financial reporting within the company. And fourth, you design and implement internal controls to provide reasonable assurance of preventing fraudulent financial reporting. And I think one of the best talaga of implementing internal control is to mandate in the articles of incorporation or even in the corporate bylaws na merong maximum period lang dapat yung maximum period lang ng audit engagement would be around 5 years. Then you have to change an auditor. Kasi many entities kasi are quite comfortable na and they've built na a strong business relationship with an auditor that might hamper na the independence kasi super ano na kayo reliant with each other. In fact, it has caused nga 'di ba some news parang early this year that General Electric, the massive appliance production company in the US, is finally changing its auditor from KPMG to Deloitte. And KPMG has been the auditor of General Electric for 100 years. Imagine, same auditor for 100 years, and they were forced to change auditor early this year, because General Electric has been hampered with so many accusations of manipulating their financial reporting and their financial performance. And how was it able to do it? Because obviously, they've been working with the audit firm for so long. Halos ano na, kung isipin mo, parang may-ari na rin ng KPMG ng General Electric. 100 years? Diyos Maya. It's nearly about the same existence of the entire Philippine Republic, if you think of it. Right? So I think the best one really is to impose now a requirement na palit-palit tayo ng auditor from time to time. Para ano naman, para reliable yung magiging audit natin from time to time. Pero mahirap kasi yung i-impose sa mga certain companies considering na baka meron nga talagang mga correction or mga nahimas-himas na mga accounts dyan that the old auditing firm must have tolerated in some sense. So changing would probably sever certain relationship, and then the new one would uncover those kinds of anomalies. So yun din yung reason bakit hindi nagpapalit ng auditor. Alright? Now, let's proceed to the fraud triangle. Kasi the fraud triangle will tell us now, class, bakit nangyayari yung fraud and why fraud or is fraud now parang eminent in a particular entity. Parang, will fraud ba happen or take place in a particular entity? It depends on the existence of the fraud triangle. Why it's called fraud triangle? Because it is in the shape of a triangle. May tatlong elements yan and they form like a triangle. But that triangle may not necessarily result to a panatag mom, ha? Kasi diba parang, I'm a panatag mom. No. The fraud triangle is comprised now of an opportunity, rationalization, and pressure. So pag present itong tatlong ito, then fraud can be committed, or fraud, the risk of fraud being committed is quite high. So we will discuss now these three elements of fraud that we call the fraud triangle. And the first one would be, ito nasa baba, di ba? Pressure. Okay? Pressure is a person's pressure. No, no. A person's incentive or motivation for committing fraud. Right? So incentive or motivation, ano yung nagpupush sa'yo para kanino ka bumabangon? Char, para kung mag-commit ng fraud, charot. No. And what are the three types of pressures that lead to misappropriations? We have financial, emotional, and lifestyle. Financial means there is a need for you to commit fraud because walang-wala ka and you really need it. And you probably lived your life beyond your means, or you have, you know, high personal debt that you have to pay off, tas due date na, or meron kang pinag-utangan na loan shark na may mga goons shark, nakas maka K-drama, and hinahabol ka na nila, so you've committed fraud para mabayaran sila. Or you have, you know, incurred heavy financial losses or made bad investments or nagkapa ka, so kailangan mo bayaran to 200,000, so nangawat or nangati ka or nangawat ka sa company using fraudulent schemes. That's financial. Emotional, on the other hand, could be your emotional status, like inggitera ka, diba? Or ma-pride ka, you have a big ego, or you're disgruntled with the company considering that your performance was good but it was not being appreciated. So mangawat na lang ka para you know, para quits, parang ganon. Or your inability to abide by or respect rules, or coercion by bosses or top management. Nag-ingnan ka, giforce ka nila to do it, because if you won't do it, then they will not be able to do sa taas, kasi kailangan nila ng someone from baba to trigger something. Kasi parang, for example, yun yung naging internal control. So kailangan nila nakakonsyaba sa baba na position. So that's also emotional. That's emotional blackmail, for example, if you're forced to do something fraudulent because, again, if you're not gonna do it, you'll be fired. And of course, your lifestyle. Sige kag panugal, sige nanugal ka, or say alcoholic, or sexual relations, meaning your salary is not really that high, pero nakay skabetse. Yes, ang skabetse, usually ang skabetse demanding man na sila og material things, kay alam nga naman, di ba, kung walay kapalit na material things, alam nga na magpadot sila minyo, di ba, pares nimo. So ma-force ka ron mangawat sa company para mapalitan og Birkin, ang imong kabit, Birkin pa. Di ba, dapat pagkabit, sekosana lang. Ang wife ang Birkin, di ba? What's sekosana again? Oh my God. Anyways, that's the thing. So again, and then family or peer pressure. Dato kayo mo igsuon, so kailangan nimo mulaban, di ba? Kailangan nimo musukol pag family reunion, so mangawat na pug ka para makapalit ka og new car, kay bago na pug car mo igsuon. Ano lang, di ba? So those are the kinds of situations that would motivate a person to commit misappropriation of assets of the company or to commit fraud. Okay? So those are the three: financial, emotional, and lifestyle. Pag financial, obviously, kwarta mo gud at the end of the day ka rin sa tanan. But again, financial is the need to do it for your survival. Yun yung difference ng lifestyle. Kasi sa lifestyle kasi hindi siya need. More on want. Right? Now, let's proceed to the third, the second one of the fraud triangle, which is opportunity. Opportunity is the condition or situation that allows a person or organization to commit and conceal a dishonest act and convert it to personal gain. But if it's opportunity, if you notice, pag opportunity siya, kahit pa there's a need, if the opportunity is not available, you cannot perpetuate a fraud. Right? So kailangan siya hand in hand. Because the opportunity allows the employee now or a member of the organization to do something that he has already planned, necessitating out of the pressure. The pressure is the one pushing him, but making it possible is actually the opportunity. And these opportunities may include two factors: internal control factors and other factors. Internal control factors means that the company's internal controls are not that effective, and the employee has found a way to circumvent these controls. Sometimes kasi if you're doing the same job and doing the same position or responsibility for so long, that you've already realized that, ay, pwede ditong isingit ito or pwedeng gawin ito na hindi na-detect. Because repeating something over and over again will make you an expert for that particular function. And lacking certain controls would allow that employee to do something that he has planned to do without being detected. So there are enumeration there of factors, internal control factors that would actually provide for an opportunity. Say, for example, you've been in the company for 14 years and you've been trusted enough that you are parang given so much leeway in doing things. That's an opportunity. Or there are inadequate documents and records, or the company is not really imposing certain authorization procedures or even review ng mga transactions. So madali talagang manipulate ang reporting process ng entity without such kind of control. Other factors may include the complexity of the transactions, or yung numerous adjusting entries at the end of the year. So doon isisingit blindly or parang surprisingly mga certain transactions that were not properly accounted, tapos they will be passed off as year-end adjustments. Or even operating on a crisis basis, considering there's a crisis and everyone is aligaga. So you actually committed a fraud without being detected kasi everyone are quite busy and overwhelmed by the crisis. And of course, low employee morale and loyalty. For example, if you're paying salaries that are so low that these employees, even if they're supposed to review this kind of transactions or supervise it, but they just allow it to happen, that someone would circumvent it because they're already parang low morale. Parang, what's in it for me? The company is already making a lot of profit, but I'm still being paid this low. So why should I do my job properly? Parang ganon. And you know, if you notice, salaries kasi and money are quite the motivation that employees also need in order for them to perform their functions well or better, right? And then the third, if you notice, the opportunity pala would provide you two types, which is to commit the fraud, an opportunity to commit the fraud, and the opportunity to conceal the fraud. Kasi ang opportunity kasi, it's not enough that you can do it, but it's also important that that particular opportunity would also allow you to do fraudulent acts with impunity, meaning you will not be detected and you will not be punished. And you can only do so if that particular opportunity will prevent you now to be detected, right? And sometimes this is possible if that particular person would be allowed to process a transaction and at the same time, he is the reviewing entity. Siya din ang magre-review. So basically, for example, a person is allowed to do a transaction, but that person is also the one updating the general ledger. So by omitting something or by adding something and updating it in the general ledger, basically that person is committing fraud that will not be detected kasi nagmamatch ang GL tsaka yung transactional records. Unless, of course, kung may gagawing overwhelmingly 100% audit on invoices na mag one-on-one talaga ang auditor og review. Kay mama naman dyan yung missing na invoices, nalagi record, tapos wala nila invoice. Otherwise, suntok sa buwan na lang later na ma-discover ka, kay mag-sampling lang man na ang auditor. So may not necessarily detect your particular transaction na imong gi-add na nag-match sa imong GL. Kaya normally, pag mag-match ang GL o ang imong transactional records, wala na. Kay ang idea man was that that particular person preparing the transaction will forward the documents, and then the person updating the GL will just base it on the forwarded documents. Yung wala may na-forward the documents, pero ikaw may mag-edit sa GL. So ang assumption na nakaroon was it was forwarded properly. So, alright? And then there's also an opportunity to convert the theft or misrepresentation to personal gain. So nangawat na ka, nag-commit ka of fraud, pero di din mo ma-convert into something. So wala, nagyapon may pagwa, di ba? Kung mag-fraud na ka, di din mo ma-enjoy personally. So that particular opportunity should also allow you to convert the misappropriated asset or the stolen amount to cash that you can now appropriate for your personal gain. All right? Now, one example of which would be the opportunity to round off yung mga sahod ng mga employees per centavo. I-round off mo yan, tapos may nakuha ka mga 50 centavos, 85 centavos, 60 centavos na digits. And then you are the programmers. You have the opportunity now to get these centavos na round off nimo, tapos i-deposit nimo sa imong account. Or you credit it to your account, and then later on, in cash nimo. If you can find an opportunity that you can encash it without detection, then that's good. Because you won't be detected, right? And that's opportunity to you to commit fraud, all right? And of course, the moment that these two are available, yung pressure and then yung opportunity, and then you were able to rationalize all of these, and then you've moved into deciding whether you commit fraud or not, then obviously it's up to you na. It's up to your rationalization, or it's up to your personal upbringing, whether you will commit fraud or not. Kasi available na yung mga recipe. There's already the pressure, and there's also the opportunity to commit it. All right? Now let's proceed to computer fraud. Okay, computer fraud class, it's basically just fraud that is committed through the use of computer information technology. So again, fraud lang talaga siya, but it will only be computer fraud if this will take place or be carried out using information technology like computers, or say your smartphones, because basically it's just really as a mini computer given the capability of sending text or making calls. But again, that's really just computer at the end of the day. So again, examples of computer fraud would be unauthorized theft, or destruction of software or hardware, altering computer records, or obtaining information or tangible property illegally using computers. So makakwalify din as computer fraud yung pagnanakaw ng car details, banking details, which happened to my friend pala. Parang what happened was parang naka-receive siya ng email apparently from Metro Bank saying na may problem daw at kailangan niya mag-login, and then she clicked that one, and it apparently looks like a legit website then, but I don't know why, but she didn't check the URL. But you can actually check the URL, and if the URL looks dubious, you don't do it. Kasi diba parang may mga official website naman ang banks, and they use the official URL talaga. If it's BPI, it's bpiexpressonline.com or bpi.com.ph/ganito. So if this is not an official website, parang mag-second thought ka na dapat, diba? Pero I don't know with her, but she proceeded to actually receive a text message, confirmation text message upon clicking it. So parang for her, ay, pasok. And then they also marked their parang contact number into parang kaya mga tututu, yung mga ganun. So parang legit talaga tingnan. So she replied the bank details, ay the parang maiden name, yung mga ganun, yung mga security features na the usual information. So nung nangyari yun is parang nasimot yata yung kanyang savings. Mga ano lang naman, mga 80,000. But at the end of the day, ano lang yun, parang 2 bags din yun. So it's quite valuable. Pero pinaghirapan niya yun eh. Tapos fresh lawyer pa lang siya. Like kakapasa pa lang niya. So parang, di ba kung ginastos na lang sana niya yung 80,000 for parang gift niya sa sarili niya for passing the bar. But again, you have to be careful talaga with these kinds of na mga updates. Because again, if it's urgent, and meron talagang problem, the bank will not send you an email. In fact, the bank will not even send you a text message. The bank will call you. Tatawagan ka talaga. Kasi ganun ang emergency, it should be a call. Pero I don't know why, but she clicked it, and then apparently, ngayon, wala na yung savings na simot. Alright? Now, with computer fraud class, we'll divide it into different types as well. Input fraud, ito yung fraud referring to the input, which is the data being entered into the computer system. Ito yung pinakamadali for perpetrators because they only have to understand how the system operates so that they can cover their tracks. And usually, ito yung pag pinapapasok ka ng certain information, that's input fraud. Kasi it will just be sent to them and they already got your information. Processor fraud naman, on the other hand, is the unauthorized system use, which includes the theft of computer time and services. It would include now the the installation of a fraudulent software that would manipulate now the processing of the computer information and computer system, and then what will happen now would result to the appropriation of certain bank accounts or cash or even other assets of the entity. Pwede din niya siya um, uh, ipasok yung computer system just to steal mga intellectual property rights. Say, if you are a design company or a manufacturing firm, especially ngayon, yung mga drug o yung mga pharmaceutical companies, yan, chances are may mga, ano yan, mga attempts to um, hack their system to steal now the IPs for these supposed to be valuable vaccines na dinidevelop for the pandemic, right? Then meron din tayong computer instructions fraud that includes tampering with company software, copying software illegally, or using software in an unauthorized manner, and developing software to carry out an unauthorized activity, right? And then we also have data fraud, which is the illegal use, copying, browsing, searching, or harming of company data. This is the biggest cause of data breaches. Is the biggest cause of data breaches is employee negligence, and of course, output fraud, which would involve now showing a monitor, the a hacked monitor or manipulated monitor or display to show otherwise a different results than that was inside the database. So they would perpetrate it by using forged, authentic looking outputs, such as the one used sa kong friend na parang email. Once you click it, it's a fraudulently forged website talaga that would appear to be authentic and real looking. So ikaw din, papasok ka din ng bank details. And of course, it may happen also by, say, publishing on the desktop something way different, like parang ma-deceive yung employee and a different amount or a fictitious amount as well, right? So next meeting we will discuss computer fraud and techniques. So I don't have much time kasi ano na tayo, 9:47.